They will tell you, yes, they will, that there are thousands of different architectural styles.
Thousands of them.
To which the answer is,
Why don't you jump up a car?
scratch that. The answer is, that is not entirely accurate. Because you see, in reality, there are just three architectural styles. Everything else is combinations, tributes, offshoots, well, commentary, which can be beautiful, harmonious, brilliant, in fact, but there are no new canons, just three architectural styles. The word architecture comes from the Greek language, which ought to be a clue. Before we talk about real architecture with rules, proportions, and a system, let's get this part out of the way. Humanity has always been keen to build impressive things like pyramids, ziggurats, timber holes, pagodas in East Asia. Some of these structures required a good measure of ingenuity. Earthquake-resistant timber joinery, massive stone stacking, complex drainage, and so forth. None of it qualifies as architecture, though, at least not in the sense of a coherent, teachable, repeatable system. They're proto-architecture or quasi-architecture, monumental, symbolic, often clever, but still pre-system. There's no consistent proportional grammar, no mathematical vocabulary for design. Everything was local, experimental, and isolated. Oh yes, I know, the pyramids, Egyptian and Mesoamerican. Now, the pyramid isn't really a clever invention, it's a geometric necessity. Anytime you stack material high and want it to stay standing, you naturally widen the base and taper the top. It's the least imaginative shape you can build. Pyramids required enormous labor, logistics, and organization, but four stable, sloping faces meeting at the top, calling it a sophisticated engineering feat or an architectural masterpiece, that's quite a stretch. Yes, I know they're fascinating. Yeah. However, insisting that they're sophisticated is a sure sign of very poor taste. Now, once we get past the so-called Greek Dark Ages, folks begin to figure out the columns. It took them quite a few centuries, but the three orders were eventually finalized: the Doric, Ionic, Corinthian. Clever, beautiful, admirable. But let's be honest. A forest of columns holding up a roof. Is that architecture or is it a giant decorative tent with legs? Oh, the Parthenon is magnificent. Seriously. But without Rome, Greece would probably still be just a footnote, a collection of exotic construction experiments. Rome, on the other hand, took Greek ideas, engineered them on a massive scale, systematized them, and created the first true architectural style, one with rules, proportions, and a repeatable vocabulary that could be taught, copied, and refined across continents. Architecture as we know it was born Greco-Roman, the first architectural style, one of the three. There are two names we must mention, two influential figures that will be associated with Greco-Roman architecture forever. There's Vitruvius, who wrote the manual, and Apollodorus of Damascus, Roman engineering genius. That said, please allow Emperor Hadrian to join them. He was the only ruler in history who was also an architect and continued working as an architect, designing and engineering buildings and overseeing their construction as he ruled the empire. He popularized the dome. He was obsessed with domes. As they systematized Greek shapes and methods, the Romans added the dome and the arch. In addition to the designing know-how, they also invented, Roman concrete, which facilitated things tremendously. Okay, Roman concrete, it's a mixture of lime cement and volcanic ash. They had a dozen different recipes for it depending on the building's location and purpose. The heavy version, the light version. Roman concrete was a live thing. It had a way of self-adjusting. Cracks healed themselves when they came in contact with water, and specifically salt water. Roman concrete also hardened underwater, which came in handy when they built bridges and, yes, roads too. Today we know a great deal about Roman concrete. We know the components, but we can't replicate it. You know what the problem is? Testing. You could put together a few dozen tests, build a few dozen structures using different trial versions of the stuff, but then you'd have to wait a century or so to see which one of them is capable of self-repairing and can therefore endure for thousands of years. 80 to 100 years is, by the way, the average lifespan of Portland cement, after which it begins to crumble and fall apart. The Greco-Roman style comes back periodically all around the globe. There are variations, offshoots, combinations, but the elements are unmistakable. The pediment, the columns of all three orders, miniature pediments over windows, cornicing. Well, you see all those like in all major cities. So, Vertuvius, Apollodorus, and Hadrian, the Greco-Roman style. Then came the long period of stagnation, and something new appeared on the horizon. Constantine the Great thought about renovating Rome, which had fallen into disrepair, had been fallen apart by the time he came into power. He gave up the idea and built a new capital city in a place known up until then as Byzantium, and he named it after himself. Hey, he was like within his rights, right? As the Latin West continued to decline, the Greek East began to rise rapidly. Because of Constantinople's location and popularity, the place became very, very wealthy very quickly. But you see, copying old forms wasn't enough. They wanted something different, something new, something that would reflect their opulence or whatever. And they came up with it rather quickly by historical standards, like the pointed window, the pendative dome, and let's just drown it all in ornament. Justinian I, emperor and political visionary, Artemius of Tralles, mathematician and engineer, those two names will be forever associated with the Byzantine architectural style, or canon if you prefer it. Rome built horizontally. Byzantium made stone float. Hagia Sophia was the first building where light itself became the structure. It was all Byzantine magic. Engineering plus ideology plus imperial ambitions plus spirit. Inspiration. It may not be as ubiquitous as the Greco-Roman style these days, but for many reasons, it continues to surface here and there, sometimes in very unlikely places. Venice, that little city was more Greek than Italian in spirit for many centuries, and the Byzantine influence in it is striking. The Muslim conquest took Byzantine ideas all the way to Spain, resulting in the so-called Moorish architecture. Islamic architecture itself is largely Byzantine with a few additions. And yes, parts of Russian and Ukrainian architecture, those are distinctly Byzantine, also with a few additions, such as the Onion Dome. But now you might say, wait a minute, what about Baroque? Isn't that a completely separate, standalone style? Well, if the Renaissance was largely Greco-Roman revival, Baroque emerged not too long after the Ottomans conquered Constantinople, and some of the city's designers and engineers fled to Western Europe. Baroque, when all is said and done, is a combination of Greco-Roman and Byzantine on steroids. Oh, please don't bring up the interrupted pediments. They made those even in ancient Greece. Seriously. Pediments are not load-bearing structures. They're mostly ornamental, and ornaments can be changed on a whim. It's not a big deal. Interrupted pediment. What? But now, oh, now we come to the most mysterious part, the third architectural style, that, by the way, appeared as if out of nowhere and was nothing like the other two. To be fair, there was a transitional movement known today as the Romanesque period. It was in large part Greco-Roman without Roman engineering. After the fall of Rome, archives burned, naturally. Continuity of learning was rudely interrupted, and when the dust settled, folks wanted to build stuff like the Romans of yore. But they lacked the know-how, the learning, and the materials. Thin walls tilted or fell apart, roofs collapsed, foundations crumbled. They didn't have the math, so they chose the only other alternative they could think of to prop up those walls and roofs. Let's just use more material, more and more. Thick walls don't collapse. Yay! This went on for a few centuries, but then something happened in the city of Paris, no less. This is kind of fascinating. Almost every major story about Paris starts with a woman. Saint Genevieve saved Paris from the Vikings. Anne of Kiev saved it from remaining a provincial dump forever. She was the daughter of Yaroslav the Wise, the ruler of Kiev and Rus, which was within Constantinople's sphere of influence. She was well educated, spoke several languages, was energetic, active, and they say quite beautiful. A political marriage was arranged. The daughter of the Kievan prince would marry the king. No, not the king of France, but rather the king of the Franks. France back then did not yet exist as a geographical entity. She brought with her to Paris, well, lots of things. Byzantine culture, certain Byzantine religious and secular rituals, some ideas about proper hygiene, Greek and Slavic manuscripts galore, and the Greek name Philip, up until then unknown in Western Europe. Suddenly, Paris was becoming popular as a cultural and religious center. So much so that only 2 generations later, 2 men, Louis VI, king of the Franks, and Suger, priest, mathematician, philosopher, decided to stick it to Rome. Well, not quite rebel against Rome or the Vatican or detach themselves from it in a style of Martin Luther and Henry VIII, which came later. They proposed merely to show Rome that Paris was also important to Christendom. It was a cultural center with its own traditions. It didn't have to ask Rome what to build and how to build it. So Abbot Suger, that is Suger, not sugar, while Rome continued to be in a high degree of disrepair and Constantinople stagnated, and Romanesque architecture was clumsy and not very pleasant to look at, Paris proposed to go higher, literally. Thus there appeared the pointed arch, the rib vault, and a bit later the flying buttress. Gothic architecture was born. Italians mocked it, naturally. Gothic was a derogatory term.
Yes, that's what those ignorant Goths build.
Goths? Oh, yeah. Another word for barbarians. Saint Denis is the first fully Gothic building. Ideology, light theology, and engineering all in one. Everything tended upwards towards God. Those thin columns. Wow. However, how do you build walls that don't feel like walls? How do you keep those walls with large windows sporting stained glass paintings? How do you keep them upright? At some point, engineering faltered. When they were erecting Notre Dame, the walls kept collapsing. The roof kept caving in. The engineer in charge of the project came up with a genius solution. Prop them up from outside. Distribute the weight. The flying buttress appeared and was later on used ubiquitously. They are strikingly beautiful. Oh, and by the way, if anyone ever tells you the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés is Romanesque, try not to laugh. Yes, portions of it are Romanesque, obviously. Equally obvious, however, is the fact that the tower is Gothic. You might as well view that structure as transitional. Architecture runs and lives in cycles. The Baroque era yielded to neoclassical. All Byzantine niceties ornaments were renounced, and the remaining elements were strictly Greco-Roman. Oh, but then came Beaux-Arts, the return of the Byzantine addition to the Greco-Roman model. Gothic revival swept across Europe and the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries. St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, well, in fact, most American churches built in the so-called colonial style or colonial revival are really a variation of Gothic. Look at this one. And this one. And yes, Trinity Church in New York is obviously Gothic. Less obvious but still Gothic in spirit is Christ Church in Philadelphia. No, please don't bother me with castles. Yes, they're Romanesque and they're Gothic, supposedly. They're mysterious and intriguing, but not particularly beautiful. Not what you'd call eye candy. Unless, of course, they're decorative, built not as fortresses meant to protect the owner's ass from impoverished plebeians and a neighbor's military attempts to take over, but as symbols of something or other, especially and specifically as a way of saying, I miss you, Richard, as in the case of Ludwig, King of Bavaria, who commissioned them to commemorate his friendship with the great composer who no longer wanted to have anything to do with him. 3 cities, Rome, Constantinople, now Istanbul, and Paris. 3 cities, 3 architectural styles. But now let's not forget the most important, or at least the most unexpected part. You may have noticed that the examples we've been looking at are, for the most part, temples and palaces. In Greece and Rome, there were also theaters and bathhouses, but those are exceptions, side note. So, the church and the palace, architectural staples. Query, what about, the population? Those who couldn't afford to live in a palace. Where did they live? Can you afford a palace? Slapdash, ad hoc, provisional houses and buildings have always been around, built with garbage materials and without much engineering involved. In ancient Rome, they were called insulae. The word insula means island. And yes, they were urban islands. Standalone structures that were sometimes 8 stories tall. They weren't much to look at. They often caught fire and burned to the ground, and nobody minded because new ones would replace them very quickly in a matter of like a couple of months. They weren't architecture. They were shit. Does this remind you of anything? No? Wait. Majestic architecture surrounded by slums. That was always the story throughout human history. But the Industrial Revolution brought with it new methods, new materials. There was a lot of trial and error, but from 1830 to 1940, roughly, beautiful residential blocks, mostly Greco-Roman, also known as neoclassical, began to appear in historical centers at first and then outward towards the outskirts. Functional sewage systems and paved roads, those helped a lot. Cities became beautiful. Paris, Vienna, London, New York, St. Petersburg, Madrid, Rome, those were suddenly pleasant, desirable, worthy of visiting more than once. And this lasted, well, barely a century. After World War II, we're back to slapdash. Why? I honestly don't know. But all these supposedly utilitarian residential buildings, they're very depressing. They're insulae. When all is said and done, that's what they are. Temporary, provisional, and spectacularly ugly. I don't know, is it because today's developers have absolutely no taste? Or is it that because commissions and committees in charge of a city's architecture, all they know how to do is take bribes? I don't know. Anyway, yes, suger, not sugar. I'm not just a writer and storyteller, I'm also an artist specializing in cityscapes. My method is set up in front of what you're going to paint and paint what you see. There's one caveat. What I see, what I'm painting, it shouldn't be boring or depressing. If I am bored or sad when I'm painting, all it means is that whoever designed this garbage had no taste whatsoever. As you travel the world and see all kinds of cities with all kinds of urban planning, bear in mind, not everything should be classified as architecture. There are three styles, three canons. In order to create good, eye-pleasing architecture that lifts you up rather than depresses the shit out of you, you must study in great depth those three canons and keep them in mind at all times. And now you know the secret of architectural history. Use it wisely. Thank you for watching. Please like this video. Please subscribe to this channel. Visit us on Patreon. Please visit my site as well with books and the paintings. I'm Ricky Vernio coming to you from Brooklyn, New York, and I'll see you soon.